My wife's betrayal shattered me, but I found strength and a path to redemption. I had always trusted my wife, Emily. Ours wasn't a perfect marriage, but it was built on a foundation of honesty, or so I thought. My best friend, Jason, had been in my life for as long as I could remember. We'd grown up together, shared countless memories, and supported each other through thick and thin. I never imagined that these two most important people in my life would betray me in the worst possible way. It all started with small things, barely noticeable. Emily had been distant lately, coming home later than usual, her phone glued to her hand more often, and there was a strange tension whenever Jason was around. At first, I shrugged it off as work stress or just a rough patch in our relationship. We had been together for almost a decade, after all, and things weren't always as exciting as they used to be. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. One evening, after a few drinks with Jason at our usual spot, I returned home to find Emily acting more distant than ever. She barely spoke to me, and when she did, it felt forced. I told myself that I was overreacting, that I was just being paranoid. But a voice in the back of my head kept nagging at me, something wasn't right. The turning point came one night when I noticed her phone buzzing nonstop with messages. I wasn't the type to snoop, but the uneasy feeling inside me had grown too strong to ignore. While she was in the shower, I grabbed her phone, and that's when my entire world came crashing down. There were countless messages between her and Jason. Flirty, intimate texts, and then, photos. Photos of them together, more than just friends. My stomach turned as I scrolled through the evidence of their affair. It wasn't just a fling, this had been going on for months, right under my nose. I dropped the phone in disbelief, my hands shaking, my heart pounding in my chest. How could they do this to me? My wife, the woman I loved, and my best friend, the person I trusted more than anyone? Betrayal doesn't even begin to describe the emotions that flooded through me in that moment. Emily came out of the bathroom, drying her hair, oblivious to the fact that her secret was out. I stood frozen, unsure of how to confront her, or if I even could. My mind raced, trying to process what I had just seen. The life I thought I knew was shattered in an instant. "Who is Jason to you?" I finally asked, my voice betraying the anger simmering beneath the surface. She looked at me, eyes wide with panic, realizing that her secret had been exposed. She didn't deny it. She didn't even try. All she could muster was, "I'm sorry. Sorry." That single word echoed in my mind as the reality of the situation hit me like a freight train. All the trust, all the love, the years of our marriage, they had thrown it all away. I was left standing in the wreckage, unsure of where to go from here. But one thing was clear, this betrayal would change everything. The days following my discovery were a blur. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, and certainly couldn't look at Emily without feeling an overwhelming mix of anger and heartbreak. The house, once filled with warmth and laughter, had turned into a cold, suffocating space. Every corner seemed to remind me of their betrayal, the times they spent together while I remained blissfully ignorant. Emily tried to talk to me, but what could she possibly say to make this better? Her apologies felt empty, like pouring salt on an open wound. Each "I'm sorry" only deepened the pain, reminding me of the fact that she had chosen to destroy our marriage for months, with Jason, my best friend. The thought of it twisted my stomach in knots. I knew I needed to confront Jason. Ignoring the situation only made the resentment grow, festering inside me until it was unbearable. I wanted answers. I wanted to know how long they had been sneaking behind my back, what they had said about me when they thought I wasn't watching, and how he could look me in the eyes while lying to my face. The confrontation came one evening, when I finally worked up the courage to face him. I called Jason, my voice tight, and told him we needed to talk, alone. I could hear hesitation in his voice, but he agreed to meet me at a small bar we used to frequent together. A neutral ground, far from Emily, far from the reminders of what had been destroyed. Walking into that bar felt surreal. It was a place filled with memories, birthday celebrations, weekend hangouts, drunken nights filled with laughter. But now, it was just another symbol of betrayal. Jason sat at the bar, a beer in front of him, looking more uncomfortable than I'd ever seen him. I took a seat beside him, not saying a word at first, just watching him squirm under the weight of his guilt. He knew why I was there, and there was no way out of it. After what felt like an eternity, I broke the silence. "How long?" My voice was steady, but there was a sharpness to it, cutting through the thick tension between us. Jason exhaled heavily, rubbing his hands over his face before finally meeting my gaze. I never meant for it to happen. It wasn't supposed to go this far. "How long?" I repeated, my patience hanging by a thread. "A few months," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "It started after that night we all went out together. We were drunk, and I cut him off, unable to bear hearing the details. So, you just decided to stab me in the back? You didn't think I'd notice, didn't care what this would do to me." He looked down, shame evident in his expression. I don't have an excuse, man. I messed up. I've been carrying this guilt for months, but I didn't know how to stop it. Emily and we didn't plan it. That's supposed to make me feel better? I snapped, my voice rising. You were my best friend, Jason. We grew up together. How could you do this to me? His silence was deafening. There were no words that could make this better, and we both knew it. The anger inside me surged, and for a brief moment, I considered throwing a punch, letting my fists do the talking. But what good would that do? It wouldn't fix anything. It wouldn't erase the images burned into my mind of him and Emily together, wouldn't heal the wounds they had inflicted. Instead, I stood up, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. You're dead to me, Jason. I don't ever want to see you again. Jason didn't try to stop me. He didn't say another word as I walked out of the bar, leaving him behind. The friendship we once had was over, destroyed by his betrayal. As I drove home that night, the reality of what I had lost hit me hard. Not only had I lost my wife, but I had also lost my best friend. Two people who had been the most important parts of my life were now gone, and I was left alone in the aftermath of their lies. But despite the overwhelming sadness and anger, I knew one thing for certain: I couldn't stay trapped in this pain. I had to confront Emily next, and decide what came next for me, for us, or if there was even an us left to salvage. The confrontation with Jason left me with a hollow emptiness, but the next hurdle was Emily. I couldn't avoid her any longer. The house, once a shared space, now felt suffocating with the weight of everything left unsaid. She was trying, in her own way, to hold on to the remnants of our marriage, but I could barely look at her without the bitter taste of betrayal rising in my throat. That night, I knew it was time. We couldn't live like this any longer, tiptoeing around the truth, pretending that the marriage we once had could still be saved. I found her sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly into a half-empty glass of wine. She looked tired, worn down, as if the guilt had drained the life out of her. Emily, we need to talk, I said, my voice firm but calm. She flinched at the sound of my voice, as if bracing for the confrontation she knew was coming. She set down her glass and looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and sorrow. I know, she whispered, her voice shaky. I've been dreading this. I sat across from her, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on both of us. I had rehearsed this conversation in my head 100 times, but now that we were face to face, the words didn't come easily. What do you say to someone who has shattered your trust so completely? Why? I asked finally, my voice breaking the silence. Why him? Why betray me with Jason of all people? Tears welled up in her eyes, and she wiped them away quickly. I don't have a good answer for that, she said, her voice cracking. It just happened. I never meant to hurt you, but somewhere along the way, I lost sight of everything. I wasn't happy, and I made a terrible mistake. Her words stung, but what hurt more was the realization that she had been unhappy, and I hadn't seen it. I had been so focused on maintaining the status quo, on keeping our life together, that I had ignored the cracks forming in our marriage. But none of that excused what she had done. So, what now? I asked, my voice steady but distant. Do you want to fix this? Do you even care anymore? Emily looked down at the table, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. I don't know, she admitted. I love you, but I don't know if we can come back from this. I don't know if I deserve for you to even try. Her honesty hit me hard. For a moment, I wondered if there was any part of me that still wanted to fight for this marriage. Could we ever rebuild the trust that had been broken? Could I forgive her, and Jason, for what they had done? But deep down, I knew the answer. Too much had been destroyed. Even if I wanted to try, the image of them together would never leave my mind. The love we once had been poisoned by their betrayal, and there was no going back. I don't think I can do this anymore, Emily, I said quietly, the finality of the words sinking in. I can't be with someone I don't trust. It's over. She nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face. I understand, she whispered. I'm so sorry, for everything. We sat in silence for a long time, the reality of the situation sinking in for both of us. There was no yelling, no dramatic outbursts, just the quiet, painful acceptance that our marriage was over. Over the next few weeks, we began the painful process of separating our lives. Emily moved out of the house, and I was left alone to pick up the pieces of what remained. Friends and family tried to offer support, but it all felt hollow. How do you explain that your wife and best friend betrayed you in the worst possible way? I found solace in the small things, taking long walks, throwing myself into work, finding moments of peace in the chaos. But the nights were the hardest. Lying in the empty bed that we once shared, my mind would drift back to everything that had happened, and the loneliness would settle in like a heavy blanket. But with time, the pain began to dull. I started to see a future for myself beyond the wreckage of my marriage, a future where I could rebuild and start over. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the weight of it all felt unbearable. But I knew one thing for certain: I had survived the worst of it, and that meant I could keep moving forward. As for Emily and Jason, I didn't know what became of them. I didn't want to know. They had made their choices, and now I had to make mine. My life was no longer tied to theirs, and that was a small comfort in the midst of the pain. In the end, I realized that betrayal, as devastating as it was, didn't define me. It had hurt me, broken me, but it didn't have to break my spirit. There was life after betrayal, and I was determined to find it. The months that followed were a strange mix of freedom and sorrow. After Emily moved out, the house felt both emptier and somehow lighter. There were no more whispered apologies, no awkward tension hanging in the air. But the silence was deafening at times. I had gone from having a life filled with noise, whether it was Emily's laughter or Jason's texts, to complete stillness. But the quiet was necessary. It gave me the space to reflect, to process the anger and sadness that still lingered in the corners of my mind. I started seeing a therapist, something I'd never imagined doing before all of this. It was there, in the safety of that office, that I began to unpack the layers of hurt, betrayal, and resentment I had buried for too long. Each session was like peeling away a bandage, painful but necessary to start healing. One day, during one of those sessions, my therapist asked me something that stuck with me: "Do you believe you deserve to move on?" At first, I didn't know how to answer. I had been so consumed by the betrayal and the anger that I hadn't even considered what I deserved. All I could think about was how unfair it all felt, how Emily and Jason had stolen the life I thought I'd have. But as the question lingered in my mind, I realized I had been holding myself back, trapped in the narrative of what had been done to me rather than focusing on what I could do for myself. Slowly, I began to reclaim parts of my life. I started going out more, seeing friends who had stuck by me through the worst of it, even though I had pushed them away at first. I reconnected with my brother, who lived across the country, and spent a few weeks visiting him. Being in a new place, away from the memories that haunted my home, was like taking a breath of fresh air after being underwater for too long. My work became a source of comfort too. I threw myself into new projects, taking on more responsibilities at the office. I wasn't running from the pain, it was still there, lurking beneath the surface, but I was learning to live with it. The ache of betrayal was something that would take time to fully heal, but each day it became just a little more bearable. One evening, months after everything had fallen apart, I found myself sitting in the same bar where I had confronted Jason. It wasn't intentional, I had been out with some coworkers, and we ended up there by chance. But this time, it didn't feel like a place of betrayal anymore. It was just a bar. The weight it had once carried was gone, replaced by a sense of acceptance. I had moved on, in my own way. I hadn't forgotten what had happened, I never would. But I had made peace with it. Emily and Jason were no longer a part of my life, and I was okay with that. They were mistakes I had lived through, lessons learned the hard way. As I sat there, nursing a drink and listening to the chatter of strangers around me, I realized something important: I wasn't angry anymore. Not at Emily, not at Jason, and most importantly, not at myself. The weight of that anger, that bitterness, had lifted. I had survived their betrayal, and I had come out stronger on the other side. Life was far from perfect, but for the first time in a long while, I felt hopeful. The future was uncertain, but it was mine to shape. And that, I realized, was the most important part of all. I had reclaimed my story. As I walked out of that bar, I felt lighter than I had in months. The road ahead wasn't easy, but I was ready for it. For the first time since my world had fallen apart, I knew I was going to be okay. It took almost a year before I truly felt like myself again. The journey through betrayal had been grueling, and there were moments when I questioned whether I'd ever fully heal. But now, as I stood on the other side of it all, the lessons I'd learned were clear. I had cut off contact with both Emily and Jason. At first, it was difficult not to wonder about them, to resist the urge to check social media or ask mutual friends for updates. But with time, the curiosity faded, replaced by an indifference I had never thought possible. What they did or didn't do no longer mattered to me. They were ghosts of a life I no longer lived. Instead, I focused on rebuilding my own. I threw myself into work and found success in ways I hadn't anticipated. Promotions came faster than expected, and with each new responsibility, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I wasn't just the man who had been betrayed anymore, I was someone who had taken control of his own life. Socially, things were different too. I started dating again, though cautiously at first. Trust was still something I struggled with, but I made a conscious effort not to let my past ruin the possibility of future happiness. One of those dates, a woman named Lauren, surprised me. She was kind, easy to talk to, and there was no pressure to rush into anything. For the first time since everything with Emily, I found myself smiling again, genuinely, without the weight of my past dragging me down. We began seeing each other more frequently, and over time, it developed into something real. Lauren wasn't a replacement for the life I had lost, she was part of the new one I was building. She knew about my history with Emily and Jason, and she never pressured me to forget or move on quicker than I was ready. Instead, she helped me find peace with it, allowing me to move forward at my own pace. One day, almost a year to the day after I had confronted Jason in that bar, Lauren and I took a road trip up the coast. It was a spontaneous decision, just the two of us, driving with no set destination. The wind whipping through the car, the ocean stretching out beside us, and the open road ahead felt like the perfect metaphor for where I was in life. As we drove, I realized something profound. I wasn't defined by the pain I had endured. The betrayal, the heartbreak, they were part of my story, but they didn't have to be the whole story. I had survived the worst, and in doing so, I had discovered strength within myself that I never knew existed. We stopped at a cliffside overlook, the sun beginning to set over the ocean. I stood there, the salty breeze filling my lungs, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt whole. I had made it through the darkest chapter of my life, and now, standing there with Lauren beside me, I knew that the best was yet to come. I wasn't afraid of what the future held anymore. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was mine to walk. And for the first time, that thought filled me with excitement instead of fear. I had found my way back to happiness, not in the way I had expected, but in a way that felt even more meaningful. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, I turned to Lauren, her smile bright against the fading light. And in that moment, I knew, I was finally free. Months had passed since that road trip with Lauren, and life had settled into a new rhythm. I was happier than I had been in a long time, but there was one thing I hadn't yet done, something I hadn't been ready to confront until now. Forgiveness. It wasn't about forgiving Emily or Jason for what they had done. I had come to terms with their betrayal long ago. This was about forgiving myself. For a long time, I carried guilt for not seeing the signs, for trusting them, and for letting myself fall apart because of it. I blamed myself for staying in the dark, for allowing the people closest to me to take advantage of my trust. One evening, as Lauren and I were cleaning up after dinner, she said something that stuck with me: "You deserve peace, even from yourself." It was a simple statement, but it struck a deep chord. She was right, I had moved forward in so many ways, but I was still holding on to self-blame, letting it weigh me down. The next morning, I decided to take a step I had been avoiding. I wrote a letter, to both Emily and Jason. It wasn't about reconciling or reopening old wounds, it was about closure. I needed to say the things that had been left unsaid, to release the emotions I had buried so deeply. In the letter, I explained how their betrayal had affected me. I didn't sugarcoat my pain, but I also didn't lash out. I told them about the nights I spent questioning everything, the anger, the sadness, and eventually, the acceptance. But most importantly, I told them that I had moved on. That I had found happiness again, and that I didn't hate them anymore. I wasn't expecting a reply. This wasn't for them, it was for me. After I finished writing, I sat with the letter for a long time before sealing it in an envelope. I didn't send it right away. Instead, I let it sit on my desk for a few days, contemplating whether I really needed to. On a sunny afternoon, I made my decision. I walked to the mailbox, letter in hand, and after a deep breath, I dropped it in. As I walked back to my house, I felt lighter, like I had finally released something I had been holding on to for far too long. I never did hear back from them, but that was okay. The act of writing the letter, of acknowledging my pain and choosing to move past it, was the closure I needed. It wasn't about receiving an apology or validation from them, it was about finding peace within myself. That peace allowed me to fully embrace the life I was building with Lauren. Our relationship grew stronger with each passing day, and we started talking about a future together, something I hadn't thought I would be ready for so soon. But with her, everything felt natural, like we were building something that had always been meant to be. One evening, while we were watching the sunset from our porch, I turned to her and said, "Thank you." She looked at me, confused. "For what?" "For helping me find peace," I said simply. She smiled, leaning her head on my shoulder. "You found that on your own." Maybe she was right. Maybe I had. But having her by my side made the journey easier. With the darkness of the past finally behind me, I was ready for whatever came next. And for the first time, I wasn't looking back anymore, I was only looking forward. The future was ours to create, and I knew, without a doubt, that it would be filled with love, trust, and hope. I had come out of the storm, and now, standing in the sunlight, I was finally free. It was a crisp autumn morning, and the world outside my window was painted in shades of orange and gold. The changing seasons felt symbolic, like the closing of one chapter and the beginning of another. I had come so far since the day everything fell apart, and now, standing on the brink of a new life, I could finally say goodbye to the past. Lauren and I had decided to move in together. It was a big step, one that signaled the start of something more permanent. The house, which had once felt like a place filled with memories of betrayal, was now ready to be transformed into a space where love, trust, and new beginnings could flourish. We spent weeks packing up old things and making room for the life we were about to build together. As I packed, I came across old mementos, photographs, cards, little reminders of a life I had lived with Emily and the friends we shared, including Jason. For a moment, I felt a pang of nostalgia. Not for them specifically, but for the person I had been before everything changed. It was a strange feeling, looking back at those moments with the knowledge of what would eventually happen. But instead of sadness or anger, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. As painful as it had been, the experience had shaped me into who I was now, someone stronger, wiser, and more aware of what I truly wanted from life. With a smile, I boxed up the past and labeled it "old memories." I wasn't erasing them, they were part of me, part of my story, but I was finally ready to move on. The day Lauren moved in, the house felt different. Her energy filled every room, making the space feel alive again. We spent the afternoon arranging furniture, laughing as we tried to fit a couch through the door and deciding which walls to hang her art on. It wasn't just about blending our possessions, it was about blending our lives. That evening, as we sat together on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I realized how peaceful I felt. There was no lingering bitterness, no anger gnawing at the edges of my heart. Just contentment. I had found my way through the storm, and now, standing here with Lauren by my side, the future felt full of promise. "Are you happy?" Lauren asked, her head resting on my shoulder. I didn't have to think about my answer. "I am. More than I ever thought I could be." She smiled, squeezing my hand. "Me too." For the first time in a long time, I knew that I was exactly where I was meant to be. The pain and betrayal of the past had taught me valuable lessons, but they no longer defined me. I had built something new, something real and lasting, and that was worth everything I had been through. As the stars began to dot the sky, I closed my eyes and breathed in the cool autumn air. This was it. A fresh start. A new chapter. And I was ready for it. With Lauren beside me, the future didn't seem so uncertain anymore. It was ours to shape, and I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together, stronger and more resilient than ever before. I had found my way back to happiness. And now, for the first time, I was ready to live fully in the present, leaving the past behind once and for all. The journey had been long and difficult, but standing here, I knew it had all been worth it. This was my life now, a life filled with love, trust, and hope. And I couldn't wait to see where it would take me next.